Good evening, everyone. We are truly fortunate to have here today with us Professor Quigley. As a young international lawyer, particularly, I am honored to moderate this session. Professor Quigley is a prominent international lawyer and professor at the Moritz College of the Ohio State University. He has spent his career working on the issues like human rights, genocide, and the Palestinian issue. He is the author of many important books, including The Statehood of Palestine and The Legality of a Jewish State. So his expertise makes him the perfect person to guide us in today's discussion, which is the two-state solution. The two-state solution is a phrase which has become a cliche, swinging between the reality and myth. On the one hand, recent developments are giving it new traction. An increasing number of states, especially the European states, have recognized or on the way of recognition of Palestine's statehood. The upcoming UN General Assembly will be probably the showcase of this new wave of recognitions. Also, Palestine's long-standing attempt for the full membership at the UN is gaining wider and wider support. The International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion of 2024, has already clarified its stance, its opinion, and confirmed that Israel is not only an occupier and also a de facto annexer in Palestine's territory. On the other hand, the facts on the ground tell us a different story. Settlement expansion continues, especially nowadays, aiming a bolder plan of dividing the West Bank. Also, the total occupation plans about Gaza is there. We are talking about it every day, almost every day. We are hearing about it. Therefore, and also the United States, at least the minimal rhetorical support for the two-state solution is diminishing. Therefore, many of us now wonder whether this framework, two-state solution framework, is still valid, is still possible. Professor Quigley, with your expertise, we would like to hear your overall assessment of the legal and political validity of the two-state solution under today's circumstances. If you don't mind, I prefer to move on with specific questions, several questions for the sake of clarity. If you agree with this plan, I can start with the first question. Okay, I assume you don't mind. Okay, so first and the most basic question, as a brief introduction for this topic, what are the main legal pillars of the two-state solution? When we talk about this phrase, what should we understand? Briefly, can you explain it?
Well, as for the legal pillars, I suppose one would say that in principle, there is an entity called Palestine that has existed for quite a long time. And that is the territory that is being discussed. The idea of two states is that this would be the best way to resolve the ongoing conflict. Now, one can speak about it in terms of legal pillars, or one can speak about it in terms of practicality and necessity. The general question of statehood is not really connected to a legal right in the sense of what a state should be on which territory. You have the international community accepting different entities as states, and that can change over time. But with regard to Palestine, I think perhaps the most appropriate way of addressing the question is to ask what Palestine is as a state, how it became a state, and then discuss proposals that would divide its territory. The state came into existence in a rather unusual fashion, namely as a result of the developments of the First World War and the aftermath of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire lost territory in the Arab world, and Palestine was formed out of a portion of that territory. So that occurred roughly 100 years ago, which is relatively recent in terms of human history. It's not like states of Europe that go back farther in history. Palestine as an entity goes back much farther, but as a modern state in particular borders, that is the borders that one finds today, it is quite recent. The borders were actually defined not by Palestine itself or anyone in Palestine. They were defined by France and by Britain in the year 1920, when after the war ended in 1918, France and Britain were in military occupation of the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire. And they decided, even before there was a peace treaty with Turkey, they decided that they were going to keep these territories for themselves. They had agreed upon that, in fact, during the First World War. So in 1920, they concluded a treaty. It was in the month of December of 1920. It's a treaty that anyone can look up on the internet. It's called a Treaty on Certain Points in the Ottoman Empire territory, and this was done by France and Britain because of the fact that they had agreed to divide this territory between them. So now that the war ended, they were dividing the territory between them. So they were really doing it for their own purposes. And
it was just a bilateral treaty, right? Between France and Great Britain. It was just a bilateral treaty.
A bilateral treaty, yes. It's a very unusual bilateral treaty since neither France nor Britain had any territorial rights. They were belligerent occupants. They were military occupants. The territory was still the territory of Turkey because at that point there had been no peace treaty. The peace treaty was not concluded and finalized until the year 1924. So it's a treaty whose legality can be questioned because states that do not have rights in territory cannot divide them up. It's as if, the government of Uruguay were to agree with the government of Venezuela to divide some territory in Pakistan. They just had no legal right to do that. That doesn't mean necessarily that the borders that were set in the treaty have no validity. Over time, those borders were not questioned. They were accepted by different parties. So one can say that even though the borders initially had no basis in law, they could be considered to be valid by the general acquiescence of the parties involved and by the acquiescence of other states. But in any event, this is how the borders of Palestine were set. Now, in a war situation, one normally waits until there is a peace treaty to determine who has title to the territory. In this situation, Britain went ahead, namely in the year 1920, in fact, in July of 1920, and declared that it was going to remain in Palestine, and that it was going to use a system that was just devised by the League of Nations as its method of governance. That is the system known as mandates. So Britain had no legal basis for doing that. Again, it had no territorial rights. There was no peace treaty. So that was quite unlawful. But Britain was in the territory, and it was not going to be thrown out. In both Syria and in Iraq, there were military efforts to drive Britain and France out of the territory. Those efforts failed, and France and Britain were able to continue. Then the peace treaty was concluded in 1923 with ratification and finalization in 1924. And that did deal with the question of status. The treaty did not mention by name the entities within the Arab provinces of the Turkish Empire, but the treaty did specify that Turkey was renouncing its sovereignty in those areas. And it also specified that the entities that were in those areas, again, without naming them, but it specified that those entities were states, S-T-A-T-E, states as a matter of law. And it called them in the treaty, this is the Treaty now of Lausanne, 1923, it referred to them as the detached states that were being separated out of the Arab provinces of the Turkish Empire. So Turkey renounced sovereignty. It did not give sovereignty to France or to Britain, although they would have very much liked to get sovereignty. In fact, there had been a treaty drafted by Britain and France in 1920 called the Treaty of Sèvres, S-E-V-R-E-S, the Treaty of Sèvres, that would have given sovereignty to France and Britain. But as a result of the developments within Turkey between 1920 and 1923, Turkey was not willing to renounce in favor of France and Britain. So it simply renounced without specifying the names of any beneficiary of renunciation, but specifying that the entities that would be coming out of the Arab provinces, that those would be states. So in effect, the Treaty of Lausanne accepted the statehood of Syria, of Iraq, and of Palestine. So, I mean, that's the date, I think, from which Palestine comes into the international system as a state. Now, the problem was that Britain was not willing to leave. Even though it gained nothing by the treaty, it remained in Palestine. I mean, normally when you have a war and a peace treaty, and the peace treaty specifies who has sovereignty, that is who gets sovereignty, and everyone else leaves. But Britain didn't leave. And it remained until 1948, in fact, in Palestine, remaining with a claim that it was there lawfully because of the mandate concept in the Covenant of the League of Nations. But that concept also required a state, to gain sovereignty before it could have that status of holding a mandate. And Britain never gained that status. So Britain remained essentially illegally until 1948. And of course, during that time, it followed a policy of promoting the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And it did that by bringing in a substantial population, largely from Eastern Europe, largely a Jewish population, that immigration changed the demography of Palestine quite significantly, and then set the stage for a claim of statehood on the part of a Jewish state. That action on the part of Britain was quite unlawful, given that Britain was a belligerent occupant. It did not have the right to change the character of Palestine. A belligerent occupant is supposed to maintain the status quo in a territory. So promoting the migration from Eastern Europe was a violation of Britain's obligations. But nevertheless, that is what happened. And that then led to a situation where the Jewish minority, which by the 1930s constituted about 1/3 of the population, they could begin to make claims that they should have territorial status in Palestine. The British idea is expressed in the Declaration of 1917 that goes by the name Balfour Declaration. That declaration talked about a Jewish national home, but without saying that it meant a territorial state. But in any event, Britain had no legal right to determine what status Palestine would have. But by the 1930s, by the middle of the 1930s, the population in Palestine saw that the migration was so substantial that its hold on its territory was going to be threatened, because not only by then was the population of Palestine approximately 1/3 Jewish, but that sector of the population had support from Europe and from around the world for a claim to statehood. So the Arab population in Palestine began a plan of civil disobedience, and then that escalated into warfare in order to drive the British Army out of Palestine. That began in 1936 and extended into 1938. And that gave rise to the idea in Britain that perhaps a division of the territory would be appropriate. The British government did not embrace that idea at the time, but importantly, the rebellion was suppressed by Britain in an extremely brutal fashion, with commission of multiple war crimes, crimes against humanity, collective punishments of the population, sending leaders into exile, and in effect depriving the Palestinian population of any military capacity that it could use to oppose the Jewish minority if it came to a military confrontation, as it eventually did in 1948. So in that year, the Jewish minority declared a state in Palestine without specifying borders, but declared a state. The Arab sector did not declare a state because they considered that the state belonged to them. And so there was no Arab government set up. The British government asked the United Nations to come up with a plan for what to do. The Arab states, and there were 4 or 5 Arab states that were members of the UN by that time, they all suggested that the matter should go to the International Court of Justice to say what the status of Palestine should be in the event that Britain withdrew. And Britain was at this point indicating that it was planning to withdraw, and it was being asked by the United Nations to withdraw. The United States, which was a major proponent of partition, and the Soviet Union, which was also a major proponent of partition, they both opposed the idea of asking the International Court of Justice for an opinion. I think they were both of a mind that the legalities were on the side of there being a single Palestine state on the basis of the Treaty of Lausanne. So they opposed this, but many other states in the UN supported it. In fact, there were several votes on this proposal to ask for an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. And on one of them, the vote was absolutely split in terms of the number for and the number against. But under the rules, that was not good enough for it to pass. But I just mentioned that as an indication that many states of the UN were of the opinion that that there should be a request to the International Court of Justice. But that was not done. The elements that declared a Jewish state were able to prevail militarily during 1948, and they took most of the territory of Palestine in that year. And that situation then obtained up until 1967, when the Jewish state, which had called itself Israel, when that state then occupied the remainder of Palestine, Palestine as defined in the 1920 treaty. So that meant that Israel was in control of the entirety of the territory of Palestine. Now, in 1964, a political organization formed itself within Palestine called the Palestine Liberation Organization, which took as its goal the liberation of Palestine, which would have meant Palestine within the territory as defined in 1920. That's 1964. But then you have Israel taking over the remaining part of Palestine. And by the early 1980s, the Palestine Liberation Organization came to the conclusion that it was not realistic to try to liberate Palestine within the borders of 1920, and said instead that it was willing to set up a government within the territory occupied by Israel in 1967 only. And that would be about 22% of the territory of Palestine. So that changed the political dynamic because with that change in policy, the Palestine Liberation Organization was now saying that it was willing to accept that there would be a Jewish state in a portion of Palestine. It wasn't, the PLO wasn't specific at that point as to whether it was only the dividing line would be the 1967 line, or whether it would be a Palestine state in somewhat more of the territory. But in any event, the PLO was indicating that it was willing to accept a Jewish state in a significant portion of Palestine, and for there to be a Palestine state in the remainder of Palestine. So that is how, I'm sorry if I gave a very long answer to your question,
not at all.
but that is how we get to the point of asking ourselves about the two-state solution, because this would mean two states in Palestine.
Yeah. It was I think, very good summary of what has happened so far. So we can observe that it actually started by, and I mean from the perspective of Arabs or the local Palestinians, it started with non-recognition of a Jewish state by assuming that it's their sovereign right to be there without accepting any other state. But in the course of history, with some compromise, they came to the point to accept the existence of a Jewish state, maybe in even a bigger portion of the Palestinian territory. And today, I think we came to the point that the Jewish state doesn't have any willingness to recognize any Palestinian state anymore. I don't know, would you agree with this timeline and, let's say, development line?
Well, yes, at this point, the current government of Israel is not willing to accept a Jewish state, I'm sorry, a Palestine state. I hesitate to call it an Arab state because there are other minority
Yeah,
ethnicities too, but we roughly we can call it an Arab state. Yeah, so you can say that in the 1980s, the PLO said it was willing to take only part of the territory. But now, as you say, the government of Israel says, oh no, you can't have even that for a state. It all belongs to us, the entirety of what was defined in 1920 as Palestine.
yes. And the current stance, I mean, like current ignorance or denial of Israel, the Israeli government, of the existence of a Palestinian state is obviously against 1993 and 1995 declarations, agreements as well. Would you like to just, like share some basic points about those agreements and declarations too?
Well, yes, in 1993, as you say, there was an agreement whereby the government of Israel agreed with the PLO that the two parties would negotiate and would decide on borders, which implied that there would be two entities, there would be two states, and all that remained was to have agreement on exactly where the border would be between them. And they did engage in some negotiation. That occurred during the year 1999, continuing into the year 2000. And those were very difficult negotiations that eventually collapsed. But from the standpoint of the PLO, it was problematic because it was unclear what would happen with the Palestinian diaspora, the refugees who are outside of historic Palestine. What would happen to them in the event that a Palestine state were established in only one sector of the territory? And that turned out to be an obstacle that could not be overcome in the negotiations that were held in the year 2000 in the United States at a location called Camp David. So that was July of the year 2000, because from Israel's standpoint, they said, well, if you are going to have a state in a portion of the territory, that is all you get. And the people who were expelled, the people who were displaced in 1948, they would not be able to come and live in their home areas because those areas are in Israel. Now, Mr. Arafat did not agree to that. And that is a major reason why that negotiation failed, because he was not willing to say that the refugees would have no right to return to their home areas. So the idea of the PLO about two states was that there would be a division of territory, but that the refugees would have a right to go back to wherever they had their place of origin. But in any event, that negotiation did not succeed. There was kind of open warfare for the next several years. And the Israeli government then began bringing in large numbers of its own population and immigrants from elsewhere in the world to settle in the territory that it occupied in 1967. And that has progressed now to the point of Mr. Smotrich, the finance minister, being able to say, we are settling large numbers in order to preclude the possibility of there being a Palestine state. And he has said that specifically within the last few weeks in regard to Israel's plan to begin settlement in the area that's called E1, which is just to the east of Jerusalem. And if that area were to be settled, it would separate the southern part of the West Bank from the northern part of the West Bank. And that is specifically Mr. Smotrich's plan, that he wants to do that, so there could be no territorial integrity for a Palestine state, and Israel would continue to control it and even to annex it formally and to, unilaterally try to make it part of the state of Israel.
With this division plan of West Bank there and the total occupation plan of Gaza is in another hand, considering all these factual realities and circumstances, maybe it's not a purely legal question. It needs a sort of political and factual assessment as well. But as an expert for decades on this matter, I would like to ask you, do you think it is the two-state solution is still a valid and viable plan, or international law scholars or decision makers or the supporters of the Palestinian cause or whoever, should they start thinking on another viable alternative? What's your take on this sensitive matter?
Yeah, this is a very difficult point. One might say, from the standpoint of the Palestinian population, you have no realistic possibility of gaining a state. You should work for something else. And the proponents of that point of view say, well, if we had a single state that would include the territory as defined in 1920, the population of that state would be roughly 50-50 as between Jews and Arabs.
Which is fearsome for Israel, I think, which is scary for, for Israel government.
Exactly. I mean, you do have situations where even a minority population is able to control, like South Africa under the apartheid system, but it would make it very uncomfortable, let's say, for Israel, because it would have to say that we would have democracy and everyone could participate. So this might, in fact, result in there being a state that is not identifiably Jewish any longer. So I mean that's one point of view on the side of the Arab population. At the same time, they would be giving up the idea of having a Palestine state. There would be no government that represents the Arab population. And that government has been able to achieve certain things at the diplomatic level, so that in a way that is something that would be given up if one were to say, well, we won't have a separate state. On the other hand, if the separate state is so weak and so much under the influence of Israel and the United States, then perhaps it's not worthwhile to have a state.
But it seems that there is a dilemma for both sides. Yeah? From Israeli perspective, like at first glance, politically, it can seem as a victory to diminish the existence of the Palestinian statehood and sort of absorb the entire territory into its state. Yeah, it might seem as a victory, but in the meantime, such a scenario would cause the problems that you mentioned, because the demographic balance will be completely destroyed, and the Israeli government will have to act as an apartheid regime, maybe like in the real sense. So it is not it shouldn't be a very preferable option for the Israelis in the meantime, even though it may seem as a victory. So maybe it can gain more support from their perspective to have a Palestinian state, even as a maybe puppet state or a very weakened state under the supervision of Israel or United States or some other influential powers. So this is the dilemma. Do you have any idea what the public opinion's tendency is towards? Like having the entire territory regardless of its outcomes, or taking into consideration this concern, still being stuck to this two-state solution plan, even if like in a symbolic sense or on the paper. I'm particularly the public opinion of Israel, like Israel's side, or decision makers' general tendency.
Yeah. I don't think there is a clearly defined public opinion on this in Israel. But I think that the opinion would generally be against having a single state, and that it's preferable simply to control the Palestinian territories without there being a state. So the options would be, one option would be a single state, another option would be two states, a third option would be Israel in control the way it is. You might call the status quo, the current situation.
Like leaving it indeterminate.
Yeah, so I think if you wanted to ask about Israeli public opinion, you would need to ask about all three of those options.
Yes. And coming, going to the other side, the Palestinian side, after all sufferings and factual realities, do you have any idea whether they are still stick to this two-state solution plan, or actually it's hard to articulate it, but I have heard some opinions from some Palestinians before. I'm talking about political figures, influential figures, arguing that one state solution may not sound very charming or very appealing, but strategically it can work in favor of the Palestinians and Palestinians' rights and total welfare in a better way. So it can be a strategic choice because of the demographic advantage, which you have exactly mentioned. So I have heard such a line of thought before among some Palestinian, as I said, political figures. But I'm not sure if it's a popular idea or not. So this is the question. Do you have any idea about that? Is there a support for two-state solution regardless of what? Or such a strategic choice can be considered as well?
Yeah. Well, I think some polling has been done. And I think, as you say, there are political figures on the Palestinian side who have come to the conclusion that you mentioned, that this would be a better choice. There seems to be some division as between younger people and older people on the Palestinian side.
So the younger ones are more inclined to which line of thought?
To one state.
One state,
To
okay.
one
It's
state.
interesting point.
Yeah. Which is interesting because if you go back to 1935, you did have a similar division of opinion, I think, among younger and older people. The older people were hoping to negotiate with Britain, and the younger people were saying, there's no prospect of negotiating with Britain. We have to fight them. But in any event, that does seem to be something of a dividing line on the question. But I think one can't say that one point of view or the other has overwhelming support presently.
Okay. There were very interesting points. And before moving to the Q&A session, the last question in my list is as follows. Among some prominent international law scholars, there is an also strong argument. I mean strong in terms of the level of endorsement, arguing that the Palestinian entity or Palestinian people missed a great opportunity right after the announcement of the partition plan at the UN General Assembly by not declaring their own state. The Jewish side, the Jewish entity, or whatever we call it, the Jewish entity at that time, which was not named as Israel yet, announced their states. They embraced the partition plan. They announced their state, while Arabs completely denied this plan, also denied the existence of the Jewish state. So they opted for conducting a battle to remove the Jewish state and assert their rightful claim to the sovereignty. And because of that opportunity, because of missing that opportunity, the Palestinian statehood actually could never be formed because they lost that war and they lost the subsequent wars. And over time, Israel has almost always, apart from some exceptional periods, it has always expanded its control over the territory. And at the end of the day, the Palestinians have been cornered in some enclaves on which they could not establish and sustain their full sovereignty, full effective control, because even for their relations with the external world, they became dependent on Israel. So as conclusion, they could never achieve the level of statehood. They were stuck to that situation of how do they call it? Status nascendi, like state nascendi, emerging state, but could not emerge. I know because of your publications that you don't agree with this argument, but I still wanted to ask about it here to hear your response to this argument for our audience. So how do you assess this line of arguments?
Well, I think with hindsight, one can say that the Palestinians would have been well advised to accept in 1947 what was being proposed by the UN General Assembly. They might have a state in some part of Palestine. Whether that is what would have happened, I'm not sure, because the Zionist forces in 1948 were forcing population out of Palestine. That might have happened in any event. But as of that time, I think from the Arab perspective, it seemed quite outrageous to have a plan that would give more than 50% of the territory of Palestine to the 33% minority population. They just couldn't conceive of accepting such a thing because it was their country. So the plan, while one can talk about it as partition, it really meant that their state would be taken over by an outside element, by these people who had just moved there within the last few years. So one can say, well, they should have seen that it was to their advantage to accept that. But at the time, it really seemed like such an outrageous plan that it isn't realistic to think that they could have accepted it.
But according to these arguments, because of their non-acceptance of the situation and because of their non-announcement, lack of announcement of their own state entity, really a legal vacuum was created. Because according to this argument, Israel, like the Jewish entity, asserted its sovereignty, so they established their state. Arabs or Palestinians, on the other hand, didn't do it, so it became like a legal vacuum for that, and Israel filled that vacuum until today. So actually, Palestinians could not gain statehood at all. It has remained in emerging state phase. So what's your take on this argument particularly?
Yeah, I don't see that as a valid legal argument. I mean, the General Assembly resolution was only a recommendation. The General Assembly resolution never said that there is a territorial right on the part of the Jewish population of Palestine or the Jewish population elsewhere. That resolution was simply framed as a way of resolving a problem that the General Assembly couldn't see a better way to resolve. So I don't think one can say that by rejecting that resolution, the Palestinians somehow gave up their rights. They have a self-determination right, and they have never given that up.
Okay, thanks, Professor. If you have some concluding remarks, please, the floor is yours. If not, we can move to the Q&A session. I was informed about some questions, which I noted.
Yes, that would be fine to move on.
Okay. Actually, I will use the privilege of being moderator to ask my question first, because out of your speech, one question crossed my mind, but I didn't want to ask it during our session because it was going to be a sort of outside topic. I didn't want to harm the flow of conversation, but out of personal curiosity, my question is, you argued that Britain had never a legitimate right to control and make decisions about the Palestine after 1920. Can you elaborate on that point more? Because when you argued that, a couple of things crossed my mind. First of all, at that time, according to then international law, the rules of the international law at that time, annexing a territory or putting a territory under your control through force was not forbidden. So it's what Britain did. They won the war. They got a part of Ottoman Empire's territory. And then it doesn't matter whether Ottoman Empire renounced its sovereignty on the condition that it became an independent state or not. At the end of the day, the effective control used to belong to Britain. And at that time, it was not forbidden. So Britain could position itself as a decision maker. And the second point is that it utilized mandatory systems. So in 1922, there was an agreement between the UN and Britain to transfer to establish its mandatory powers over Palestine. So again, what they did seems to be fitting into that mandatory legal regime. Yes, this is my question. So how can you elaborate on that point?
Yes. No, you ask a very good question, because this was a point in history when one still had colonialism. I mean, you had France controlling a good part of Africa and Britain as well. But in the covenant of the League of Nations, it was specified that the territories coming out of the Turkish Empire were not simply subject to being taken in the manner of colonial acquisition. That those territories had a right to statehood and to independence. Britain never made a claim to Palestine or to Iraq on the basis of colonialism. I mean, it never said, we get it because we prevailed during the war. It always accepted the framework of the covenant, but then was not able to satisfy what the covenant required. The system for acquisition of the territory being taken from Turkey and from Germany was specified for Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. And that system was that there would be a renunciation in favor of the Allies, and the Allies would then decide which country would exercise a mandate. And that was done for Germany. That was specified in the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany renounced in favor of the Allies. The Allies, namely Britain and France, tried to do the same for Palestine, Iraq, and Syria, but they were never able to succeed, as I was explaining earlier. Now, in 1922, you mentioned there was some action in the League of Nations, and that was an approval by the Council of the League of the mandate document that Britain drafted for its governance of Palestine. That was not an action that gave territorial rights to Britain. It was simply an action saying well, yes, if you can get territorial rights, then you could govern on the basis of your document. But Mr. Balfour, who represented Britain at that time in the League of Nations, was very clear in acknowledging that he was only asking for approval of the text of the British document, and that it would not have any legal effect until Britain gained sovereignty, which Britain was still hoping to do. It was still hoping that Turkey would renounce in favor of the Allies.
Okay, thanks a lot for this very elaborative answer. It was really enlightening for me too. So I'm moving to another question. I'm reading exactly as it is. How do you assess Israel's current policy of settlement expansion and annexation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem? Does this policy directly challenge or undermine the international community's commitment to the two-state solution? This is the question. I can also add a little part. At the moment, an increasing number of states, including European states, are endorsing the Palestinian statehood, meaning a two-state solution. So if this division of West Bank plan comes into realization, as Mr. Smotrich perceived and asserted, so how will be the situation? Those states recognizing Palestinian statehood will see diminishing and shrinking territories of that recognized state. So the international community will have to intervene to stop that, to comply, to follow up with their recognition. So what would happen in such a scenario according to your expectation? I can add.
Yes. Well, under the law of belligerent occupation, the settlements are unlawful, and that's a position that is held by all states now, I suppose with the exception of Israel and the United States, but certainly held by the European states. But you point your finger at a very critical issue, and that is that if the settlement construction continues in the way that it is anticipated, there really would not be territory that would be available for a Palestine state, unless, I suppose, the settlements were to be controlled in a way that Israel did not have the final word. That is, it's conceivable to have Israeli settlements in a Palestine state. The problem is if you have so little territory that isn't settlements, then the Palestine state has no reality. But in all of the discussions going back to 1993, it was accepted that it would be possible for there to be Israeli settlements in the Palestine state. But as a practical matter now, I think there can't really be a Palestine state unless the European states take it upon themselves to pressure the Israelis against the expansion of their settlements. And I don't know whether they're prepared to do that. They seem to be prepared now to give recognition to a Palestine state, but unfortunately more than that is required if they really think there should be a Palestine state.
Yeah. I think the international community now needs a second Namibia point, I can call, like the action they took against South African government because of their persistent presence in Namibia and because they did not relinquish themselves. almost the entire international community decided on imposing severe sanctions so that South Africa could withdraw. I think we need such a point again in the history. Otherwise, all of these recognitions and so on will be futile. They will not be very much useful.
I think that's right. And you do see discussion of that issue now within different European countries. So far, they haven't been willing to take the step that you are suggesting is necessary. They still have what's called the Euro-Mediterranean, trade arrangements with Israel. You still have European countries providing armaments to Israel, and so they haven't taken the steps that seem to be necessary if a Palestine state that is a state in reality is to come into existence.
Yes. In order to be loyal with our time allocation for this meeting, which was planned to be roughly 1 hour, I will take only one question as the last question, which is, what is your evaluation of the 2024 ICJ advisory opinion and 2025 New York Declaration on Palestine? Do you see these developments significant for the resolution of the Palestinian issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the New York Declaration is significant because it does show the willingness on the part of a large number of states to take some action. I mean, I think they need to go farther. They need to impose sanctions, and that hasn't happened yet. The 2024 ICJ advisory opinion, I think is a valid opinion as a matter of international law, not only because of the way in which the occupation has been carried out, which is what the court focused on, but because there was no basis and is no basis for an Israeli occupation from the 1967 war. That is, when you take territory in war, you can't keep it forever. And in any event, the occupation was initiated in a way that did not comport with international law. So to my mind, Israel never had a valid legal basis for its presence in Gaza or in the West Bank.
Yes. Thanks for your answers, Professor. It was a very insightful and enlightening conversation for us. Thanks for participating today and allocating your valuable time for this event. Once again, if you have any concluding remark, I can give one more space I can give floor to you again. If not, we can come to the conclusion of this meeting.
I'll just say that I'm very grateful to the foundation for organizing this session. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I also express my gratitude on behalf of them. Thanks a lot for your participation once again. Have a good day. And for our audience, have a good night.